Good evening, everybody. My name is Jared Roll, and I'm the director of the Monroe County Local History Room and Museum. And normally for our programs, that's where we would be. But starting this year, with the generosity of the United Methodist Church, we are now holding our evening programs in this space. This provides us more opportunity to have a group here that we have a little more elbow room and more space to move around afterward. But I would encourage you, if you haven't visited the county's history museum and archives, it is located just a block south of where we are now, in the former Masonic Temple building with the statue of the astronaut out front. That's Deke Slayton, or statue of Deke Slayton, because on the second floor of that building is the Deke Slayton Space and Bicycle Museum. 2 museums, 1 building. We like to connect, one of our missions at the museum is to connect people to Monroe County history in a meaningful way. And one of the ways that we do that is through public programming. And so we're very excited tonight that you chose to spend this beautiful evening with us to learn more about a very important subject in Monroe County history. I would like to put in a little advertisement for our next program. We are partnering with several organizations and businesses in Sparta to try something new. It's going to be a trivia night. So how well do you know Sparta history? It's going to be June 4th. That's a Tuesday night starting at 6 p.m. at Sparta Soda Works. And it's all ages, and it's a free event. And if it goes over really well, we might try it in other communities. That's a fun way to bring history to the community. Speaking of history to the community, tonight it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephen Kantrowitz. Professor Stephen Kantrowitz writes and teaches about race, citizenship, and Native American settler interactions in the 19th-century United States. His most recent work explores the transformation of American citizenship in the Civil War era through the experiences of the Ho-Chunk people. Steve was born in Boston and earned his PhD at Princeton University, has been teaching at UW-Madison since 1995. He is a Plainert Bascom and Vilas Distinguished Professor of History and a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships for his scholarship and teaching. Would you join me in welcoming Steve Kantrowitz?
Thanks very much, Jared. Thanks everybody for that warm welcome. I'm really glad to be here tonight. And I will get right to it. This talk tonight, The Ho-Chunk Struggle Against Removal from Wisconsin, is based on the book that I published last year, Citizens of a Stolen Land, A Ho-Chunk History of the 19th-Century United States. And based on that, you might think that I've been teaching Native American history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison since 1995. But that is not the case. I was hired, in fact, in 1995 to be the Civil War guy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And for many years, I did work that was primarily about the American struggle over slavery and emancipation and the adjustment of American society to the end of slavery. And that is what I thought I would spend my career doing. And then, one day, about 12 years ago, I was on my back patio on the east side of Madison, just off Lake Monona. There's my house. Call first. And my then colleague, Ned Blackhawk, who was a specialist in Native American history, just remarked offhand, this whole neighborhood is built on effigy mounds. And that just caught me flat-footed. And I did a little digging, and I started pulling on that thread, and by God, he was right. And this is just a tiny fraction of the mound groups around Lake Monona, around all of the 4 lakes of Dejo, Madison, 4 lakes, right? And around, in fact, all of south central Wisconsin, and in fact, all over Wisconsin. This is the epicenter of mound building for North America. And I didn't know that. And I didn't know that I was living on top of that 1,000-year-old memorial landscape. And I didn't know who built it, and I didn't know that they were still here. And as I started tugging at that thread and followed into the Wisconsin Historical Society, I discovered that a century before, a guy who worked literally in the building over from where I now work, Charles Brown, state archaeologist and museum director, had come to the same realization and mapped out the history of native Wisconsin on top of the settler plat map of the state 100 years ago. And still, neither I nor most of my colleagues had any idea that this was the case. So on some fundamental level, every level of education had failed me and had failed most of the people I knew. And that just took me finally back to that realization on my back patio, and to a deep desire to understand both who had been here and was still here long before the United States was here, and what had happened and what was still happening, and why it was that I, an American historian with many years of experience and a PhD, had no idea that this was part of the deep history of the place that I live. So this work and this talk tonight represent what the last decade or so of self-education and interaction with scholars and experts and Ho-Chunk community members, and a lot of other people, has helped me learn about the history of the Ho-Chunk people in their homeland, which we now mostly call the state of Wisconsin. And I'll take you through just a tiny fraction of the Ho-Chunk people's history, mostly a 50-year period of the beginning of their encounter with the United States. And that is a story that begins in a terrible reality, which is that between 1828 and 1837, the United States coerced the Ho-Chunk people into signing treaties that effectively stripped them of title to their ancestral homeland. And that for the next 40 years and more, repeatedly, the United States government and American settlers sought to expel the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin to homelands west of the Mississippi. Despite this, the Ho-Chunk people persisted in living in Wisconsin or returned to Wisconsin and continue to live in large parts of their ancestral homeland, and today are in fact federally recognized Indian nation, the Ho-Chunk nation of Wisconsin. And so the question that this raises is pretty elementary but really important. How did the ancestors of today's Ho-Chunk people defy federal efforts to remove them from the state? And how did they reestablish a legal claim to be here? I approached that question the way that my training taught me to, by going to the archives and going to the written sources. By doing that, I automatically separated myself from the way most Ho-Chunk people would answer that question, which is not through archives and historical sources as I know them, but through their accounts and traditions and oral transmission of what happened to them. But I did not have access to those stories when I began this work, and even to this day, I don't really have the kind of access to them that would allow me, even if I knew those stories, to have permission to share them with you. So what I have is the version of that story that's available to me through the archive produced by American colonialism. So it's a limited version of that story. Nonetheless, that archive contains the voices of Ho-Chunk people, and if you read it carefully, you can hear them and you can learn about how they were understanding and relating to the American power that was trying so hard, and in some cases failing, to dispossess them. So the green portion of this slide here is the portion of land that the United States in 1825 recognized as belonging to the Ho-Chunk people, surrounded by the lands that it reported belonging to the Dakota, to the Ojibwe, to Potawatomis, etc. But the Ho-Chunk people had long occupied and made use of lands over a much wider footprint, often sharing parts of that land with other people from other nations, even sharing villages sometimes with people from other nations. When the United States arrived in the Western Great Lakes, in this region, about 200 years ago, the Ho-Chunk people were living in about 40 or 45 distinct villages. But villages sometimes remaining in one place throughout the year, sometimes people moving around the landscape to make use of different resources, but in any case, bound together by ties of kinship, by shared culture and language, by repeated visiting and interaction that way, and by ties of clan. Every Ho-Chunk person belongs to one of 12 clans that they inherit from their father. And each of those clans has specific responsibilities in relation to one another and to the needs of the tribe as a whole. Most of that was completely invisible to American settlers and indeed to the people making the colonial sources. By the 1820s, almost as soon as the United States recognized that area as belonging to the Ho-Chunk people, American land pirates began invading that land in search of its resources, its lead in particular, but also making use of other resources that belonged to the Ho-Chunk people. These were squatters and vigilantes and local warlords who moved into the territory with the aim of stealing its resources and ultimately the territory itself from the Ho-Chunk people. Many of you know this story, you just don't know it in the terms I've just offered it to you. Because one of its main architects is in fact Henry Dodge, who among other things, before he was territorial governor, United States Senator, had been the son of a sheriff in the Missouri Territory, a slaveholder who illegally brought his enslaved property into the Wisconsin Territory, a squatter on Ho-Chunk land, and the leader of the vigilante army that ended up demanding from the Ho-Chunk people full access to their lead diggings and getting into a full-scale war with resistant Ho-Chunk people in 1827. The result of that war was that the United States insisted that the Ho-Chunk negotiate for the transmission of at least part of that land to the United States government, and in 1829, that was accomplished almost in full, with a full third of the area that the United States had recognized as belonging to the Ho-Chunk people 4 years earlier being transformed into American title, that first lower third of the Ho-Chunk lands. Just a few years later, another collision between the United States and Native people leads to another great cession of land, of the Ho-Chunk land, and that is what we call the Black Hawk War. I won't go into the details of that conflict here, but although the Black Hawk War is primarily a conflict between the Illinois militia and Black Hawk's band of mostly Sauk people, the war primarily takes place in the Ho-Chunk homeland. The Ho-Chunk were aware of the danger of a war between Americans and Native people happening on their homeland and sought to prevent it from happening. In fact, sought to hide Black Hawk's band from the Americans so they would not come into military conflict with each other, and almost succeeded in doing that. But at the end of the day, as we know, Black Hawk's band were discovered by the Americans, were chased, massacred, and defeated by the Americans by 1832. At the end of that war, there was a large army of US soldiers on the Ho-Chunk homeland, assessing its resources, thinking about what value it might have to the United States, and insisting in a treaty forced upon the Ho-Chunk in 1832 that they give up another third of the territory that had been promised to them in 1825. The treaty commissioners are really upfront about the nature of this negotiation in 1832. They write, "This treaty is made on the blended grounds of conquest and contract." The United States establishes Wisconsin in this era as a new settler colony, as a new place where the American order of things will replace the native order of things, and in southern Wisconsin, the Ho-Chunk way of doing things. And you can see the vision here in the Great Seal of the Territory of Wisconsin with all of the accoutrements of modern civilization, as they called it. Institutions, a yeoman farmer behind a team and a plow, the latest technology of lighthouses and steamships and all the rest. And in the center, a native man looking west across the Mississippi, which is presumptively where his destiny should lie, according to the founders of Wisconsin. And to make this as clear as it could possibly be, the motto of the territory of Wisconsin was Civilitas successit barbarum, roughly, civilization takes the place of barbarism. And it's very clear from this image what is civilization and what is barbarism, and what the direction of that history ought to be. The history that the United States is unfolding in Wisconsin territory is a very similar history to the one unfolding all across the Mississippi Valley and the southeastern United States. And we call this process Indian removal. Its best known version is the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but as this map just very partially shows this is a much broader experience covering a much broader range of people than the Cherokee. Not just the other tribes of the Southeast, but also many Midwestern tribes also forced into removal across the Mississippi. And while we're calling Henry Dodge a warlord and a squatter and a vigilante, we ought to call other things by their proper names, and we ought to call Indian removal what it really was, which is dispossession and exile, and frequently what we could call ethnic cleansing, because it is about purging a territory of a kind of people who are presumed no longer to belong to it. And the United States completes, or tries to complete, that process in the Wisconsin Territory with a final treaty in 1837. This one, even more than the Treaty of 1832, forced upon a band of Ho-Chunk negotiators who had been coerced into going to Washington by being denied the annual payments promised them in previous treaties, and kept in Washington until it was almost too late for them to do any planting for the following year. When they signed the treaty in Washington in 1837, they described themselves as having been under intense physical coercion and threat, and understood as they signed the treaty that they would have 4 years to remove from Wisconsin. The language of the treaty actually said 8 months. The translator had lied to them about what was in the treaty. The result of this is the United States trying to force the Ho-Chunk people from about 1840 into exile across the Mississippi River to a place called the Neutral Ground. You can see it on the map here. That territory was not meant to be a permanent home for them, but a temporary one nonetheless. They were kind of rounded up into camps along the Mississippi River and forced across the Mississippi River. There was great suffering attendant upon this. Many people died in the course of this removal and painfully reestablished themselves in a series of locations in what today is northeastern Iowa. But very quickly the United States decided that it should remove them from there as well. And here we begin to see the beginning of a kind of split in Ho-Chunk responses to this grave threat to their being as a people. And although it simplifies things somewhat, I want to represent this in the form of two different leaders and the paths that they pursue over the next decades. On the left here, in the painting, is a man called Roaring Thunder, Wakanja Erika in Ho-Chunk, known to Americans sometimes as Dandy or the Dandy. He represented the Ho-Chunk people who refused to leave Wisconsin, who figured out alternate strategies to remain within their homeland, and who actively and persistently resisted being removed from the state. On the right, Coming Thunder Winneshek, Wakanja Guga, who, though he was not happy about leaving his homeland, led his people in parts of the exile diaspora and persistently resisted American efforts to transform the Ho-Chunk people into analogs of American homesteaders and landowners. In other words, while not seeing the possibility of fully resisting the exile from Wisconsin, trying to find ways to maintain the integrity of Ho-Chunk society and culture in the diaspora. I will first follow Coming Thunder Winneshek and the people in the diaspora, and then come back to the people who stayed in Wisconsin. In 1846, the United States again forces the Ho-Chunk to move, this time on a forced march up the Mississippi to a place called Long Prairie, in central Minnesota Territory. Coming Thunder Winneshek tries everything he can to stop this. He encourages his people to flee as they're being forced to march. He negotiates with a Dakota cousin of his, Wabasha, to try and purchase a piece of land on the Mississippi where they might be able to stay. He tries all kinds of other things to delay or perhaps stall the removal of the Long Prairie entirely and create a new homeland for the Ho-Chunk of their own choosing. But military force prevails, and Ho-Chunk are largely forced to Long Prairie by 1847 or 48. But they're not happy there. The territory is too unfamiliar, it's too much unlike their own homeland, and they're persistently found outside of that territory, even in southern Minnesota and back in Wisconsin, and demanding to be removed from there to a better place. And in 1855, the federal government bows to those wishes and allows the Ho-Chunk to trade their lands at Long Prairie for new lands in southern Minnesota at a place called Blue Earth. This is a great deal in the sense that Blue Earth, just south of today's Mankato, much more like parts of Wisconsin, much more familiar landscape, much more familiar flora and fauna, and closer to the old homeland, too, than Long Prairie. So very desirable in many ways. But the treaties of 1855 and the later treaty of 1859, which established the Ho-Chunk presence at Blue Earth, carry with them a renewed commitment by the United States to transform Native people into a version of American civilization. This has been part of American policy since the very beginning, since George Washington sent agents into Indian Territory in the late 18th century. This image here is of Benjamin Hawkins, the agent to the Southern tribes in the early 19th century. And persistently, although in different ways, the United States government had pursued these policies of turning Native people from societies that used land extensively, that farmed and hunted and fished and made use of different resources at different seasons, into societies that would take up much less land, therefore making the rest of that land available for American settlement. And this was the purpose. This was the purpose of, quote, civilization for Native people, is to turn them into the kind of neighbors who wouldn't cause a problem for American settlers as they engrossed most of their domain. And the treaties of the 1850s were very insistent in forcing upon Native people English language instruction, instruction in American forms of farming, education in the Christian religion, and in many other styles and forms that demanded that Native people give up large parts of who they were in order to continue coexisting in their homelands alongside the Americans. The Ho-Chunk at Blue Earth begin to feel these forces encroaching upon them in the 1850s. And when the federal government forces the Treaty of 1859 upon the Ho-Chunk at Blue Earth, they make it explicit. The Ho-Chunk are to have their lands allotted. They will no longer own their lands collectively, but will have their lands allotted into 40-acre homesteads, one for each family. A census of the tribe will be taken to determine how many families that is, and therefore how many allotments are required. And when those allotments have been allotted, the rest of the land will be for sale to American settlers. Coming Thunder Winishek says, enough. When the federal government sends surveyors out to survey the lands, he and his friends pull up the stakes, put them in the surveyor's face, and threaten to stick him with it unless he leaves. They partly ruin the survey. When the census takers come to do the federal census, and Indian agents begin herding the Ho-Chunk into the Indian Agency stockade to do a full count of them, Coming Thunder Winishek and his friends get into the line and break it up and push people out of the stockade. And no full census of the Ho-Chunk is taken. The federal government's not fully deterred. They continue acting as though they've done a survey and a census, and they begin the process of allotting lands to some Ho-Chunk people. And there are a few who are happy to take up lands at this point, but mostly they don't. And this process might have slowly continued, except that in 1861, the Civil War breaks out. The federal government turns its attention elsewhere. And it looks for a minute as though Coming Thunder Winishek and his allies have defeated the American policy. But just to the west of the Blue Earth Reservation is another reservation that has just been cut in half by federal policy. The reservation of the people actually indigenous to southern Minnesota, the Dakota, who had formerly controlled the entirety of the territory, and now have been reduced to this tiny strip of land along the Minnesota River. That diminishment of their hunting lands and the resources available to them had left the Dakota hungry. When federal annual payments to the Dakota had ceased at the beginning of the Civil War, traders would not advance them money and spoke very derisively about the Dakota's starvation. Let them eat grass, Andrew Meyer, the traders said. In 1862, the Dakota went to war with the United States. seeing a weakened nation in the face of a civil war, perhaps unable to resist them, and pushed American settlers out of the territory in fire and in bloodshed in the summer of 1862. The federal government responds in Minnesota, the militia responds with great force, and by the fall of 1862 has defeated the Dakota in the U.S.-Dakota War, herding 1,300 or so Dakota refugees into an internment camp at Fort Snelling, and putting 400 or so Dakota fighters on trial before American military tribunals, treated as what we in the 21st century came to call unlawful combatants. Some of these trials lasted as little as 5 or 10 minutes. 303 men were sentenced to die in these tribunals. Because these were military tribunals, the records were sent to Washington, where the president had to make a final judgment. Lincoln commuted the sentences of all but 40 of these men to life imprisonment, but allowed ultimately 38 executions to go forward. And on the day after Christmas, 1862, the largest mass execution in U.S. history to this day took place in Mankato, Minnesota. The execution in one stroke of 38 Dakota fighters from a gallows in the center of Mankato. This, of course, both furthered and gave ammunition to the people who had had their eyes on the Blue Earth lands and the rest of the native lands in southern Minnesota. And in the spring of 1863, the kind of anti-Indian hysteria ginned up in southern Minnesota and continuing not only led to the expulsion, the banishment of the Dakota people from Minnesota entirely to a reservation out on the Missouri River called Crow Creek, but also the banishment of the Ho-Chunk people from Blue Earth, who had played almost no role in the U.S.-Dakota War, and in fact had tried very actively to stay out of it, knowing how badly it could go for them. Nonetheless, they too were exiled and their land stripped from them, given in exchange a piece of the very poor and barren lands out on the Missouri River next to the Dakota. Coming Thunder Winishek, still leading his people in this moment, led a movement first of scouts heading south down the Missouri River, seeking better lands, finding friends among the Omaha in the Nebraska Territory, and an exodus begins from Crow Creek, where the Ho-Chunk cutting down riverside trees, making dugout canoes, which is a technology they knew well. I've known apparently for 4,500 years, according to today's radio report, and make their way to Nebraska. By 1865, they virtually all have left Crow Creek for Nebraska, and the federal government ratifies that movement ex post and allows them to trade the lands of Crow Creek for a new reservation along the Missouri River in Nebraska. That is today's Winnebago tribe of Indians, Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, who are a Ho-Chunk people. But there's another story. To come back to the Ho-Chunk who never leave Wisconsin at all, or who, when forced from Wisconsin, persistently return. And this is the story represented by Roaring Thunder, or Kanja Edega, whom the brother of a U.S. Army officer, a guy named Charles Dease, hears about. There's all kinds of stories about Roaring Thunder, and tells his brother he wants to go find him. And when the Rock River freezes, the winter of 1841, they go down the Rock River and they find Roaring Thunder, and Charles Dease paints his portrait. And then he brings that portrait back to St. Louis, where he lives, and was like, this is not very commercial. How do I make this picture a little more commercial? How do I dress this guy up, make him a little more James Fenimore Cooper? And so we get this picture on the right, which is hanging in the St. Louis Mercantile Library and Museum to this day. But this is a kind of a fantasy Roaring Thunder. This is a Roaring Thunder out of a storybook. And American settlers love to tell stories about Roaring Thunder out of the storybook. They call him Dandy. And they call him Dandy because he wears the face paint, he's got the accoutrement, he wears fancy clothing we can't mostly see here. And they're mostly things that represent his status, his clan, his abilities, and his achievements as a warrior and as a civil leader and as all kinds of other things. But what Americans think about him is, here's a trickster. Here's a guy we keep trying to get rid of, we keep trying to get him out of the state, we keep trying to capture him, and every time he gets a slip on us. And so they tell stories about Dandy. One of them is that he's called before the governor in the 1840s asking why he won't leave the state for the neutral ground to a place called the Turkey River in Iowa. And through an interpreter, Dandy says to the governor, picks up a Bible and says, "Governor, this is a good book, yes?" "Yes, this is a good book." "If we do what is in this book, and only what is in this book, will we do right?" "Yes, yes." "Then show me, Governor. Where in this book does it say that we should move to the Turkey River?" Now, this may or may not be a true story about Dandy. It is a story that Americans wanted to be true about him, and I think there's a reason that stories like that are powerful, and there are many, many Dandy stories circulating in the collections of the Wisconsin Historical Society. I could do them all night. But the point I think that's interesting about it is that what they've done with that story is turn him into a playful trickster figure. Little comic, harmless, funny, intriguing. What they've also done is forced you to look away from the fact that federal policy is extremely clear. You have been exiled from your homeland, you must leave. That is the law. He is refusing to do it, and refusing persistently and successfully to do it. He is a militant resistant against American policy, and he has succeeded. And that story makes us look away from that and look at something else. So there's a way in which the funny stories about Dandy mislead us from seeing Roaring Thunder for who he was. And he's in Wisconsin 25 years later. Still, in 1863, after the US-Dakota War, there's hysteria among Wisconsin settlers. Is this happening next? Will the Ho-Chunk who are still here do it? Right? Will there be another rebellion against American settlement? And will it happen here? If it's going to happen here, guess who's going to lead it? This guy, Roaring Thunder. So the governor goes and has him captured and brought to Madison to interrogate him about his intentions. And Roaring Thunder explains himself and appeases and clarifies and makes it clear he has no interest in anything but peaceful coexistence with American power and American settlers. And indeed, that's the case. Roaring Thunder and his band, and many other bands like it, have occupied territory at the margins of American settlement, on the northern and northwestern periphery of American settlement, as far as up here in the 1860s, okay? And they had done so very successfully. There were not many settlers here. There was plenty of resources available, and especially because the resources that Ho-Chunk wanted to use, the resources settlers wanted to use, were often not the same. So there was a possibility of coexistence, and indeed of some mutual interest, of trading berries, of trading horses, of trading a variety of things back and forth across the line between settlers and Ho-Chunk people. And Wakanja and his people had done that very successfully in through the 1860s. Other Ho-Chunks in other parts of the state had done similar, though somewhat different things. This man, Ochoga, Blue Wing, in Sauk County, had, in 1853, looked around and said, how do we make sure that they won't come and get us? Who gets to stay? Landowners get to stay. And so he goes to the land office, and in the nature of things, nobody knows quite whether he's entitled to take up land, but he's got the cash, and he buys land like he was an American homesteader in the Ho-Chunk homeland. And you can see on the map of Sauk County in 1853, here, 3 40-acre plots in a diamond pattern, listed as belonging to Indian Aha Choker. Now, you could see this as 3 40-acre homesteads, right? And the policy of civilization at work. He's bought land, he's become a homesteader, everything's going to work out just fine. But in fact, what Ahochoga has done is much the same as what Roaring Thunder's done. He's reconstituted a Ho-Chunk village within the bounds of these 40-acre parcels. And dozens, scores, sometimes hundreds of Ho-Chunk people make their way onto those parcels. There's a spring, there's land for growing corn, there's even some hunting. It's great. It works out very, very well. As this territory fills up with American settlers in the 1850s, Ahochoga and his people are so successful in forging reciprocal relationships with those settlers that when they move closer to the town of Reedsburg. And there's visiting back and forth between Ahochoga and some of his family members and people from the village of Reedsburg. So and eventually they end up in Monroe County, actually, but that's another part of the story. I'm not going to do that tonight. what this suggests is that there are lots of ways of negotiating the settlement and conquest of the Wisconsin Territory. And so by the 1860s and 70s, we end up with two big communities of Ho-Chunk people. There are the people now in Nebraska who the federal government recognizes as the Winnebago tribe, which is what they called them in the 19th century. And then there are the people who have refused to join the people in the exile diaspora, who are these, what the federal government calls stray bands. Very insulting terminology, but that's what the federal government calls them, stray bands of Ho-Chunks in Wisconsin. There is, though, to make this more complicated, a third group. And that is the people who took up allotment at Blue Earth in 1860 and 61. About 160 families, and some of them had been exiled in 1863 along with the rest of the Ho-Chunk people. Some of them, often partly descended from French traders, or in other ways presenting themselves as fluent in English and in American society, had been allowed to stay, sometimes because the men volunteered for service in the United States Army for the Civil War. Many of them had lost their land, though, the specific parcels allotted to them at Blue Earth, because settlers had taken over that whole territory. And in the late 1860s, those folks sue the federal government. They say, we have been deprived of our rights. You know, we bought this land, it was allotted to us, and then you took it from us. We want compensation, we want reparations. And so that's a persuasive argument to congressmen in 1866 and 1867, and they begin writing legislation to grant acres of land, the right to settle on acres of land to these Wisconsin Ho-Chunks. But this is also the period that we call Reconstruction. And one of the things that characterizes Reconstruction is the creation of a new idea of uniform belonging to the nation, what we call national citizenship. This had not really been a category before the Civil War. As late as 1862, the Attorney General of the United States, when asked to define what a citizen of the United States is, he says, I don't know. None of us really know. We use the word all the time, but we don't really know what it means. Congress decides to fix that after the Civil War. And first, in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then most famously in the 14th Amendment, they define who is a national citizen. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. All persons. No longer a white republic as it had been before the Civil War, but a republic, as this 1869 cartoon suggests, in which all kinds of people belong at Uncle Sam's round, level, egalitarian table. Self-government, equal, come one, come all. Immigrants from all over the world, not just from Europe, but clearly from the Middle East and from China. African Americans, not in a subordinate position, but indeed African American and Chinese men on either side of Uncle Sam's wife. So a explicitly anti-hierarchical vision of American life and belonging. And the cartoonist really wanted this to be universal. He wanted it so much to be universal that he added this figure. Piece metal around his neck, feathers sticking up from his head. Unlike most of the other men at the table, no wife, no child. Hard to read his expression, hard to see anything about him, he's half shadowed. Native man. And the cartoonist does not know where to put him. He does not fit. And indeed, the 14th Amendment had been sort of designed to exclude him. Because all persons born or naturalized, yes, but and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Native American people, under the jurisdiction of a tribal sovereignty, of a native nation, were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and therefore were not citizens of the United States, no matter where they were born. A few were. A few people who did meet those criteria, who were not members of tribal nations, did. But mostly, this phrase was thought to exclude virtually all native people from citizenship in the United States, despite what this cartoon is sort of trying to hint at. But the ambivalence here, the uncertainty about the status of native people in relation to American citizenship was enough. And the status of the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin, rather in Minnesota, who have taken up allotments who have been granted the right to buy new lands by the federal government, who've often served in the federal army in the Civil War. Of course they must be citizens, but how? They're not born American citizens. When did they become it? They didn't, so what do? We naturalize them. And in 1870, the federal government offers to the Minnesota Ho-Chunk, they can go to the courthouse in St. Paul, and they can take out naturalization papers as though they were immigrants to the United States. The form here is not that different from what my great-grandfather David Abrahm did at Ellis Island in 1900. It says I can be self-supporting, I can do this, I can do that, and a citizen witness attests to the fact that I can do this. And so the 160 Minnesota Ho-Chunk become citizens of the United States at the courthouse in St. Paul in 1870 and 1872. Meanwhile, this story is so complicated. Meanwhile, back in Wisconsin, there is a renewed movement among the ever-growing numbers of settlers, new settlers in the Wisconsin Territory, to say, enough. The Ho-Chunk have been here 35 years past when the last treaty said they should be gone, and it's high time the federal government did something about it and rid us of these unwelcome neighbors. They don't live like we do, we don't trust them, we don't think they belong here, they need to go. And the Ho-Chunk hear this, they see the people around them turning against them and seeing that their exile might be in the future, and they undertake a series of defensive actions. For one, they write this petition to the federal government. Long petition with the names and ages of 224 Ho-Chunk men, women, and children at the end of it, but a couple of key passages in which they say they want to take up and gain the constitutional and inalienable rights of man. They want to become citizens of the United States, and that they're sufficiently intelligent to control their own affairs, willing and anxious to take up homesteads or to purchase real estate, and adopt the habits and customs of civilized life. I mean, all the key words of American civilization and of Reconstruction citizenship, all of them laid out in like a kind of grab bag of like, you like that? Okay, you like that? You like that? Will these words work? Are these the words that will get us what we want, which is the right to stay in the homeland? Because the people signing this petition are in fact describing themselves as the descendants of what was known as Dandy's Band. These are literally Roaring Thunder's people and descendants, the people least interested in adopting the American toolkit of, quote, civilization, the people most interested in continuing to live on their own terms at the margins of American settlement, who have nonetheless decided the better part of valor is to claim to want these things in this moment. But Wisconsin's Republicans' congressional delegation is committed to expelling them from the state. And as part of their vision of the perfected republic, of the post-Civil War. And they push a bill through Congress funding federal troops to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin, except that this petition comes before the United States Senate, where it is taken up by this guy, a white supremacist Democrat from Ohio, an enemy of Reconstruction, an enemy of all things egalitarian, a person who wishes slavery had never ended. And yet, though no friend of the Indian, Alan Thurman sees an opportunity here, because his foes on the other side of the aisle, the Republican advocates of Reconstruction, including those guys up in Wisconsin, are saying very openly they want to get rid of the Ho-Chunk because they're unwelcome neighbors, they're not like us. And he says, ha, you are hoist by your own petard, because you've just passed an amendment through the Constitution that says that everyone's an equal citizen. I don't think it was a good idea, but you did it. And now you forced that on the unwilling, defeated Confederate white people of the South, and forced them to deal with black people as their equal citizens and neighbors, which I don't think was a good idea, but you clearly did. And now you have a few thousand unwelcome neighbors, and you want to get rid of them? Well, lots of luck. Can't you see the hypocrisy in that? And they can, and they're embarrassed And they are so embarrassed, in fact, that they let Thurman write a codicil into the Removal Act, which is that the Ho-Chunk cannot be removed by force. They can only be removed voluntarily. And this sets a ticking time bomb under the removal process of 1873 and 1874. In the winter of 1873-74, federal troops do come down into Wisconsin, to Sparta, among other places, and begin rounding up Ho-Chunk people in their winter camps. They round up 800 or more and send them in boxcars, freezing, to Nebraska in the middle of the winter. Many people die on this journey. This is a searing instance in the oral tradition of the Ho-Chunk people to this day. A truly terrible experience. But several interesting things happen in the midst of it and in consequence of it. For one thing, Ho-Chunk people have been foreseeing this for some time. They've seen what's happening because they're paying close attention to American politics. When you're not that powerful, you have to know your enemy. And Ho-Chunks paid very close attention to Americans and American power in this era. And so a delegation has already been to Washington to lobby representatives, to find out from the Indian office what's happening, to try and make some change. A delegation led by Coming Thunder Winishek's brother, Short Wayne Winishek, and by this woman, Mary Crane, Otokawinga. She's a very interesting figure, and she's one of the very few women who is named and whose story kind of surfaces in the colonial sources I'm using. So I'll tell you just a bit about her. She was actually not born Ho-Chunk. She was born Odawa. But like a lot of Native people, on marrying a Ho-Chunk person, became Ho-Chunk and was fully invested in the life of the nation from there on. She was trilingual because she spoke Odawa, which is an Anishinaabe language. She had been educated in English in a seminary in Michigan in the 1830s, and she spoke Ho-Chunk, so she spoke at least those three languages. And in 1873, she's in Washington with a delegation of Ho-Chunk men lobbying Congress to try to forestall the removal. They don't succeed, but they do learn what's at stake. And when they come back to Wisconsin, they begin talking with the people who drafted that petition for them and talking with their other allies among the settlers, and they realize just saying the key words of American civilization isn't going to do it. They're going to also have to be able to show some documentation. What's the best form of documentation for proving that you belong somewhere? That you own something. And so in the summer of 1873 and 1874, as the removal era effort is gearing up, Ho-Chunk people, like Blue Wing 20 years before, are going to the land office and buying a parcel. Not 40 acres, and not near where they live. 2 acres, 3 acres, somewhere way north that's just been surveyed. Not someplace they're ever going to go, but they have the deed to it in their pocket. And when the federal removal troops arrive in Ho-Chunk encampments in the winter of 73-74, they find Ho-Chunk people brandishing deeds at them. And they don't know what to do, because they don't know what a citizen actually is. They don't know what the rules of the road actually are. Nobody does. And the Ho-Chunk have learned this, and they understand this. And so, finally, the removal officers say, okay, anybody who had a deed or had any plausible claim to real estate, anybody who was wearing American clothing, I didn't take him with me. I let him stay. And then, Blue Wings people in Reedsburg, they are grabbed up along with the rest of the Ho-Chunk population of that region in the removal of 1874. And when they're grabbed up, local Reedsburg people say, hey, those are Blue Wings' daughters and son-in-law on the train. That won't do. And so they rush over and they try to free them from the United States soldiers. And they get so rambunctious about it that the soldiers level their arms at them. And the captain of this detachment telegraphs up to Fort Snelling. He says, can I fire on them? And at which point the War Office is like, hold on, we don't even have authorization to use military force to remove these people. You can't fire on American civilians. Finally, people who have been removed to Nebraska on these boxcars discover there is no authority military authority there to keep them from returning. And so Mary Crane and others begin leading parties of people back across the Great Plains to Wisconsin from 1874 and 1875, at which point the federal government gives up. They write into an amendment to an Indian Appropriation Act. They write in special legislation that allows the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin to use their tribal funds to buy land and become homesteaders and citizens of Wisconsin and the United States. And that helps explain why there is no Ho-Chunk reservation in Wisconsin, but instead, individual parcels of what are now trust land, scattered over a wide area, not just this area, but over large parts of Wisconsin and indeed of other states. And how it is that the Ho-Chunk people continue to live in Wisconsin and elsewhere. This weekend is actually the powwow of Black River Falls. I encourage you all to check it out. But these are photographs from the powwow at Black River Falls. But also in other places, that's a Ho-Chunk member of Congress from Kansas, Sharice Davids, up there. And in Madison, in Dejoke, where I live, with a branch office and community center down there as well. And on my campus, now Ho-Chunk presence and past represented by this banner, which flew over Bascom Hall during commencement this year, designed by our student Molly Paulette, Ho-Chunk tribal member and a graduate PhD candidate in anthropology, called Seed by Seed, representing Ho-Chunk interpretation of the Four Lakes of Dejoke, of Madison. You know, I wrote this book, and I'm very proud of this book, but my book is representing, as my Ho-Chunk interlocutors remind me from time to time, a very small fraction of Ho-Chunk history, and very little to do with what most Ho-Chunk people would think of as representing either their history or their culture. Their history is at least 14,000 years long, and I have scratched the surface of 50 years of it. Their culture is complex and beautiful and different than mine, and I know next to nothing about it, despite my efforts to learn about it. And so I think, while it can't be the case that the fewer than 8,000 Ho-Chunk people on their ancestral homeland have the full responsibility for educating the more than 8 million rest of us, I think it's also the case that we need to pay attention to when Ho-Chunk people do try to offer opportunities for us to learn about their culture on their terms. And so it's been particularly worrying to me that the Ho-Chunk Museum in Tomah experienced a really devastating fire earlier this year. One from which they are now trying to recover. This is Joseph Lee, the museum's director and sole employee, building boxes to rehouse their collection, which thankfully was saved when the building was not. But what I really want you to think about doing as we move into Q&A here tonight is to think about contributing to the fund that's going to help rebuild the Ho-Chunk Museum. And this, you can just open up this Venmo code on your phone and contribute that way. Or you can Google the museum and send a check to their address. But I encourage you to do it this way, which is much more seamless. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure talking with you about this history. I look forward to your questions and anything else. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. And I have a microphone. If anybody has a question, be glad to come around. Two on this side. And just to point out that we do have copies of Steve's book on the table up there for sale. And since he's here, we maybe can ask him to sign a copy for you.
That's true.
Thank you so much for doing this tonight, and it's awesome to see it so well attended. May I ask 2 questions? So you mentioned that you have a lot more to tell. Would you consider coming back for another part of the series?
Sure.
Okay. Might need a bigger space. Okay, there has been a movement, and it's been approved, to build a first trading post from the settlers of Sparta by the Beaver Creek Bridge, and I would like to move that we make a Ho-Chunk, something else to kind of parallel that. You know, what do you suggest we do to kind of like carry this forward and do something to honor their history in Sparta as well?
The very first thing I would do is get in touch with Bill Quackenbush at Cultural Resources at Ho-Chunk Mission. Yeah, Bill Quackenbush. Jared's in touch with him. Because I think I've learned from my own kind of hard experience that what I think is a useful intervention in bringing Ho-Chunk history into settler consciousness is not always what Ho-Chunk people think is useful or interesting. Sometimes they do a face palm. So, and I don't always know what the right answer is, but Bill does. So, yeah.
Very good. Was there another question?
I just wanted to know if you were aware of the small hamlet, it's northeast of Toma called Blue Wing, which is Ho-Chunk.
Yeah.
Do you think that has
Yes.
any reference to the Native American?
I think that is, in fact, where Blue Wings people ended up after they left Sauk County. I wanted to know where that was. I haven't had a chance to be up here. That's why I'm coming back.
It's north off of
Yeah.
21.
Okay, that's undoubtedly it. Yeah.
Is your question over here?
Okay. So knowing this history, what is suggested for integrating this history into our current education system for different, all ages, from university level
Yeah.
down to kids that are still doing like Thanksgiving
Yeah.
program
I
stuff?
know. Yeah. So the good news is there is in fact a series of laws called Act 31 that requires just that. The bad news is either you've never heard of it or you know it's not enforced or funded, right? So for years we've had, in principle, the requirement that Wisconsin students learn about Wisconsin tribal nations, history, and sovereignty and culture, right? But it's almost no one does it because there's no infrastructure to make sure it happens, or very little infrastructure outside of individual districts to make sure it happens, and there's no funding stream to guarantee that it happens. So that's a heavy lift, but in theory, this governor is sympathetic to that, and it ought to be possible to move that forward. It is, of course, always possible to do this locally, but it's incredibly inefficient to develop curriculum district by district.
Yeah. So if educators are sympathetic, are there resources? I've seen that the Ho-Chunk have a really cool website.
Yeah.
To kind of have lots of historical information. I mean, but you're kind of saying more or less that there is no curriculum.
You can Google Act 31, and there are resources available. It's just that there's no plan for creating statewide curriculum that would actually do the work that you and I would both like to see happen.
Question over here?
I just finished reading Louise Erdrich's wonderful book called The Night Watchman.
Oh, that's a wonderful book.
And it really is probably one of the best ways to learn about all the different tactics of removal and also resistance. Are you going to continue your historical explorer beyond the 1800s and heading to 1950, what was it, 55?
53, yeah.
53.
Yeah,
That's an
yeah,
amazing
yeah.
book.
That's an amazing. Louise Erdrich is she's a writer, a novelist, a bookstore owner too, up in the Twin Cities. She's written a series of novels, mostly about the history of her own band, the Ojibwe, which are, they're history novels, but to say that is to make them sound boring and flat and like they're trying to teach you something. They are, but they're beautiful, beautiful novels. And the history trilogy, which includes The Night Watchman and The Roundhouse, are really, really amazing. She's a phenomenal writer, and those are great books and a great way to begin thinking about these histories. Me, no, I'm a 19th century historian. I'm not going to the 20th century. No. Too many live people to get in the way of stuff. No, I'm wedded, if not to specific topics necessarily anymore, to a chronology that I know a lot about and I feel comfortable with. But I do think that I am thinking about a book that would try to make sense of a really interesting split in American historical consciousness that goes by this simple observation. Native and non-native people have very, very different perspectives on Abraham Lincoln. And I'll just leave it at that. That's worth thinking about.
All right, how about we have one more question, and then, unless there's more burning questions, we have just a little more time, and then Steve will stick around because we have refreshments back there, and we'd love to have you not rush out, but stick around for a little bit. So let's do 2 more questions.
One is very particular about maps, a thing that I have not been able to figure out. You have maps of the treaties attributed to Cole Sutton.
Yes.
And the western boundary before displacement, kind of the 1825 Treaty Prairie du Chien, like the Mississippi River is not the western boundary. And there's a little bit carved out from about La Crosse to DeSoto or Prairie du Chien that curves inward.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you know anything about that, because
I believe that had to do with the traders at Prairie du Chien and what they wanted. Because usually treaty boundaries have a lot to do with what traders want. And my memory from reading the Indian agency rolls from that era is that that's what's going on there. But yeah, that's the best I can do, yeah.
the second question is more like, I guess, thematic, maybe. From Black Hawk War, the neutral territory moving into Iowa, I think even the Long Prairie, the Ho-Chunk, much of their displacement seems to be driven by their population being a determined buffer between other native groups. In between the Iowa, the Sac, the Fox, the Dakota, the Ojibwa.
Yeah.
Is that intentional? Does that say something about their culture or just their size?
That's the case in the neutral ground. In the case of the neutral ground, they are very deliberately being put into the neutral ground between Dakota and Ojibwe people who are at war with one another in different ways, right? And that's not a comfortable place to be, of course, because they're not in very good relation with either of those groups for different reasons. The other moves are not, they're not intended as a buffer. In fact, what the federal government was envisioning, and one of the reasons that these moves are so kind of capricious, is that the long game for the federal government in this era is to consolidate all of the northern tribes on one gigantic reservation. And they never put that plan into effect, but they're always thinking, let's wait and do this because we're going to do that next. So that's actually quite contrary to the idea of a buffer zone, is they're imagining one big pen, essentially. Yeah.
Have you ever interviewed any of the Ho-Chunk people?
Oh, sure, yeah. Right from the beginning of this work, I kind of realized I couldn't just do it without talking to Ho-Chunk people, and so I sort of found a couple of people in Madison who were kind enough to take the time to entertain my very ignorant first questions and to steer me in the right direction and allow me to keep coming back and talk with them. They're thanked in the acknowledgments to the book. And then over time, I've developed relationships with other Ho-Chunk culture workers, especially. Sometimes as they come to the university to get advanced degrees, and sometimes, just because of the kind of work I'm doing, the kind of work they're doing. So those conversations are kind of ongoing and chastening frequently, but also really interesting and really important part of this project.
Okay, so as we are all here tonight listening to this, and more people are becoming more conscious of the true history, are more reparations being sought, and are more efforts to kind of come back with more fairness being offered?
Right, so reparations is the word that comes out of a slightly different history. I used it a couple of times tonight, I realized. But really, I think what the bottom line that, from my understanding of it, is what Ho-Chunk and other Native nations really want is a full recognition of both of their sovereignty and of the threats to and erosion of that sovereignty by American power in different ways over a long period of time. And so that is a crucial place where people outside tribal nations can play a role here, because we can think of removal as an attack on tribal sovereignty. We can think of the boarding schools of the 1880s through the 1970s as attacks on tribal sovereignty. We can think of lots of different experiences as attacks on tribal sovereignty. but they're ongoing to this day. I mean, you know, the attack on Native jurisdiction over Native territories, or the continuing assaults on the Indian Child Welfare Act. Right? These are present day, these are 2020s concerns that go back deep into the history of settler Indian relations, but that are really alive now. And I think one of the things that we all can do is not so much individually go up to Ho-Chunk or other people and say, what do you need from us? But educate ourselves about these histories and about these laws and realize, like, wow, there is a lot of ignorance masquerading as common sense and legal knowledge all the way up to the Supreme Court, including justices that I bet a lot of us really admired, that represents a deep ignorance about the history of Native sovereignty and Native life on the continent. So I think that is really a place where we could do a lot of work that we are not doing yet.
Thank you so much.
Did you have a question? Let's make sure. I thought I saw a hand over here. I don't want to ignore anybody. Okay, all right. How about let's be the last one, and then we'll break. And then
I got a question about, you're hearing quite often now about the natives that were taken and put into schools to Americanize them.
Yeah.
Were the Ho-Chunk done that way too?
Yeah, they were.
Because you don't hear about.
Oh, if you talk to Ho-Chunk people, you hear about it. Yeah. There were quite a few boarding schools in which, you know, many Ho-Chunk people still living were you know, either placed or incarcerated. The Ho-Chunk were not a reservation tribe, so the forces that took children and put them in boarding schools were frequently not the same literal, like just kidnapping out of reservation homes and taking off reservation boarding schools. But there are plenty of cases, you know, as a Ho-Chunk, I think I'm not talking out of school if I keep this anonymous, as a Ho-Chunk acquaintance of mine put it, like, you know, you're taught when the black car comes up the driveway, kids scatter, right? Because that could be the social worker coming to take it, right? So that story, that's a very live story. It's not an old person who told me that story.
Can I? Yes, Mark. I just had to add to that. So there is an Indian school, or was, in Toma, in our area.
That's right.
So, like what she was saying, most of the kids that were put into that school.
I don't know if most of that. I don't know what the composition of that school was, honestly.
No, they weren't. Yeah, they came all over Wisconsin.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 years ago, we did have a presentation, a joint program between Ho-Chunk and then Kevin, his name slips me now, Alderson, thank you, a historian who dove greatly into that history. And we hosted that at the museum, and it was packed house, and we have extensive records at the History Room archives about that story. And certainly, if you wanted to learn more, you come and visit us. We'd be glad to share that with you.
All right, third trip.
Oh, there's always more. But thank you, Steve, for coming up to John from Madison tonight and helping us learn more about this very important topic. And I'd like to invite you to stay a little bit longer. Again, we do have these books here for sale. If you would like to purchase one, I would encourage that. We have refreshments at the table behind us, some juice and some cookies, so you don't have to be in a hurry to leave. And then one more round of applause, please.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming tonight.